so I completed Final Fantasy XVI over a week ago, and it was pretty good. Not flawless by any means, but we're about to make it flawless!
Alright, that's it. Get the video.
All joking aside, one thing it did consistently well were the boss fights. Oh, how I loved the boss fights. I just wanted to do more of them. And so, with the main game out of the way, I had a cheeky peek at the hidden trophies to see what I'd have to do to 100% the game. And the two of note that caught my attention were beat a boss without taking any damage, which I was pretty sure I'd done over the course of the game, but we'll get back to that, and finish the game on the NG Plus exclusive Final Fantasy difficulty. Initially the plan was just to flawless a boss and play through NG Plus using the later icon abilities that I began to gloss over once I'd got comfortable with my loadout. But after the achievement didn't pop on the flawless boss of my choice, I learned it only counts the end bosses of the stages available to replay in the Arietta Stone, so I settled to just do it during my NG Plus run. Then, about 4 bosses in, I arbitrarily decided it'd be fun to flawless all of them. Why the hell not? So here I am, working my way through all the major bosses flawlessly on Final Fantasy difficulty, plus a few extras that I felt like doing just for the thrill of it. This video is mainly a summary of the fights, with some tips from my experience of fighting these bosses. I'm still deliberating exactly how to best go about sharing the full fights, whilst also avoiding potential spoilers, though for now at least there's a link to all of the fights in this video compiled together in the description, and I'll add info card links to the individual fights as the sections go on. I'll also be breaking up segments by quest and stage names, though boss names will be used when discussing the fights themselves. It's not a flawless system by any means, especially given NG Plus has access to the latest skills and icons, but it should hopefully be enough to prevent any major spoilers for the people looking to avoid that. Before beginning the boss bashing, I'll quickly go over my general build and equipped accessories. Weapon and armour change as I progress, but generally is best in slot for what's available at that point in the story. It's not as clean cut as playing through arcade mode with set gear, but the inability to save like you can during the story playthrough makes it less desirable when each failed attempt means replaying a whole level as opposed to just the boss. As standard, I've been running the Genji gloves for a straight up 5% damage increase, Breath of Lightning for Judgment Bolt for faster cooldowns, and Unfortunate and the Heavens, since it helps keep my level on par with the rate enemies increase in NG+. Icons and abilities meanwhile, I have Titan set up with Raging Fists and Rook's Gambit, both being counter skills intended to more heavily punish attacks, Garuda with Gouge and Judgment Bolt as a means of staggering enemies quickly and then punishing them once staggered, and Shiva with Ignition and Scarlet Cyclone, a combination mainly intended for crowd control, but they occasionally get their moments to shine within the boss battles. And so, without further ado, let's begin with a couple of bonus fights. NG Plus lets you start after the prologue, and whilst the first 2 bosses aren't counted as part of a stage, they feel important enough to warrant some flawless attempts. Shiva's Dominant starts with a bunch of enemies that Tiamat and Avis are meant to distract whilst you focus on her, though I found they dealt with them too slowly at times, leaving them to getting hit by stray attacks and then making attacks that distract from the boss, whereas using my Ignition and Cyclone combo I could take them out easily, without issue. There were 2 attacks Shiva had that kept catching me off guard. The AoE at first, because whilst it can be countered easily by both counter moves, it's faster than a lot of the other comparable AoEs, so it took some time to get used to, but with it being an early attack that's usually the opener she used, it didn't take too long to get it down. The other was the non-particle effect lunge. Being less obvious meant I'd usually use a regular dodge and counter-attack it, which every time I did, I'd get immediately smacked by a fast, short follow-up hit. Outside of that, it's a very simple fight, and there's no real surprises added in Stage 2. The ice is very telegraphed and can basically just be walked out of. Tiamat is similarly simple, with only a couple of basic swings and magic burst follow-ups as the bulk of his attacks. He can throw out bolts of magic should you be too far away, so keep that in mind. And after staggering him, he does gain access to In Ruin, a flurry of magically empowered swings that have some weak tracking, but it's not too much of a threat when you can safely counter one and then just dodge out of the way of the rest.
By a traitor's blade.
The boss of the Greatwood is pretty easy given how common this enemy type ends up being later in the game with just a few minor tweaks here and there. He jumps back before making any attacks, so it's really easy to read whenever he's going to, and right on and cut on are so slow that there's not really any issue getting out of the way of them. Quite literally, the only attack to land on my first attempt was the Assassinate, because it's the one move unique to this variant, and I didn't expect it to come out quite as fast as it did. Not much else worth mentioning, and by far the easiest boss, as you'd expect from the first, should you be going for a Medal of Valor. Another quick bonus story boss, a short stint against one of Benedicta's Eggies? E-guys? Just realised I've never actually had to think how to pronounce this whilst playing Final Fantasy XIV. Regardless, Shirada's skill set is a string of singular strikes and this slow projectile. With low health and stamina, it's a fairly fast fight with little need to move around. The only attack of note was the AoE spin, which is slightly slower coming out than most of the other attacks, so it's easy to mess up the dodge timing, though Rook's Gambit provides enough of a dodge frame to normally safely get around it. This boss I initially skipped, having not yet learned you can save in the dungeon only during your story playthrough, leading me to starting up another NG Plus run just to do it. This is also one of the few bosses where I changed my moveset for, substituting Ignition with Heatwave, a ranged counterattack, and my accessories to increase the damage and reduce cooldown for it. Benedicta, needless to say, has a lot of projectile attacks. She dashes away from you a fair bit to accommodate that, though this does in turn give you a lot of room to read what her attacks are. Similarly to Shiva, she has two different lunges, with a fancy particle effect one being a single strike, whilst the regular goes into a flurry, but with how low her phase 1 health and stamina pool and her penchant for projectiles, it's not too uncommon to stun her out of it, or just not see the flurry at all. Phase 2 doubles down on the projectiles, often throwing in 2 or 3 extras with each cast, and even a move that was skippable with enough DPS where she'll fly too fast to hit, and throws a bunch of clustered projectiles at you. I had an attempt at Heatwave countering this, but I had no luck with it. Not sure whether that's because I missed it since the projectiles are in weird spots, or if it's just not possible to do. It's hard to accurately gauge. I also found with her flyby projectiles it was often best countering the first and blocking the second. Dodging didn't leave much window to counter the second, and trying to dodge out of the way after the counter of the first had hit or miss results. Outside of this, and keeping in mind that Benedicta's lunges have additional follow-up strikes, nothing in particular is a major problem move, though keeping line of sight on her when the tornado happens is quite important. You can go off of audio cues as well, but she does do a follow-up spinning lunge, and just being able to see it makes it a lot easier to counter. After the final cutscene, however, where Torgal returns to your side, Benedicta does get access to a rather nasty flurry of attacks, starting with a large number of tornadoes around the arena, a long-distance grab, a gap-closing slam, and then a rapid string of Garuda claws that you just want to get as far away from for as long as possible, and then a follow-up slam after that. Avoid getting slapped by that massive chain, and you're pretty much good to go, and you just have to repeat the process until her health bar's completely depleted. Fun fact, the first half of the Garuda fight isn't necessary for the Medal of Valor. I did it anyway, mind you, just for the thrill of it. Not on the same run, though. Ifrit quite literally ate my input, the bastard. Unfortunately, this is also one of the few instances where you can't save mid-dungeon, with only an autosave that saves you about a minute of walking from the start, and still leaves you a minute before the fight itself, which you then have to do phase 1 of each time you want to take an attempt at phase 2. Clive vs Garuda's a bit of an odd fight, since for the most part you get yourself stuck under her head, where the AI struggles to pick the ideal attack, and since her head is the lock-on point, Raging Fists doesn't work very well at countering the attacks that are made, so it's unreliable most of the time and whiff if they do actually land the block, so I pretty much exclusively used it for the kick attacks, whereas Rook's Gambit did most of the heavy legwork, and to the point where I replaced the Heatwave accessories from before with the Rook's Gambit variants instead. Heatwave is still on my ability list, specifically because of a move where in the second half of the fight the kicks begin to shoot projectiles, and there is a point where a tornado will be used, followed by 2 kicks back to back, and since you have to move out of the way of the tornado, you're not in melee range to sort of block the leg, so I used the heat wave then, since dodging often led to me dodging into a spawning tornado. Garuda's main strikes for this phase tend to be forward and back swings with their wings, which do have different audio effects and visual cues. The back sweeps are also slightly slower and are usually fine to just ignore since you're safe under the head, whereas the forward ones you do still ideally dodge for. And all of it just leads to this really, really weird fight that's ultimately not necessary if it's just the Medals of Valor you're after. Ifrit vs Garuda, meanwhile, is barely a fight, with most of it being cutscene, though it's still easy to take small amounts of damage if you're not careful, mostly thanks to a mid-range, multi-projectile attack that I found the best way to beat was to not encounter it at all. The best way to get enough damage in to Garuda to trigger the cutscene safely is by landing the lunge, which guarantees a 3-hit melee combo and a punish, and then you just step back a bit and wait to see what Garuda follows up with before you try to repeat the process. Most of learning the fight is learning the ideal distance to land a lunge and the safe times to do so. Garuda's large wind projectiles tended to provide the best openings, though do note that after the first phase, a second projectile is added into that mix, so you have to dodge both of them before you can go for the lunge. Dodging through the tornadoes is also a good time to land a lunge if you do it soon enough, though I did find after the aerial blast segment she'd sometimes have a follow-up attack as you were going through, so I played it safe and stayed back, reacting to the follow-up attacks instead. Keep in mind, whilst you can stay back and fireball from a distance, she sometimes will do a swoop attack of her own, which after the aerial blast phase again, will become 2 swoops before being vulnerable. The easiest way to tell that swoop compared to the cutscene triggering swoops is the cutscene swoops have Garuda land before she lunges at you, but if you want to play it safe, there's no harm in trying to dodge it anyway. All in all, it's a very easy fight, just with the humdrum of having to go through a healthy portion of content to redo each attempt. After the intensity of fighting a dominant and a respective icon, everyone knows the natural escalation is a prologue boss with a pet dragon that you don't even have to fight. Ironically, I think I got hit more times trying to flawless the Knight of the Dying Sun than I did during the prologue or my first encounter, predominantly because where my first playthrough had me dodging and precision countering each of the hits in the attack strings in succession. Countering the first hit with Rook's Gambit put me in an awkward spot where it was too long to dodge immediately or I'd get hit, and if I waited to try and land on the ground and do a Raging Fists counter, I'd get hit because it would take too long to do that. So, as a result, a lot of my hits came from me using Rook's Gambit to dodge the first attack in a string and then get hit by the second. So as long as you remain aware that there's second and third strikes once he gets to his double jump phase, you shouldn't have too much trouble with them, especially given that the ad phase beforehand isn't necessary for the Medal of Valor. I guess one other thing to note is that the dragon can attack and hit you if you get too close to it, or if you hit it with one of your other attacks and get its attention, though usually Sid is pretty good at killing it quite quickly, so it's usually a non-issue, but that is something to be aware of. Returning to the place where it all began, we find ourselves fighting with, well, ourselves. Infernal Icon always starts with a Crimson Rush that can be Rook countered with ease, and I usually get a cheeky LB Judgment bolting beforehand too, as it usually has recharged by the time I get to the stagger stage. As with Garuda beforehand, the target locking makes Raging Fist counters awkward at times, and it made me opt on, once again, a single move that I could semi-reliably get the placement and positioning of to get the counter off. This move being the stomps, and even then it was a bit more of a delicate dance compared to Garuda's kicks, as if you're too close you just get stomped on, and because it goes over the block, and if you're too far back, even though you get the block from the shockwave, you don't land the punches, so a bit of a delicate dance. And on top of that, since there are multiple lock points on E3, locking onto, or ensuring that the foot is locked onto when doing it, was the only way to really reliably stop Clyde from suddenly blocking in the wrong direction. Outside of this, the other major attack I frequently encountered was Vulcan Burst, an AoE that at first I tended to Shiva dodge out of the way of, and then Ignition charge back into, but I found after a while that if I position myself next to the arm, Rook's Gambit would land all of the hits, where if you just locked onto head normally, it would end up whiffing most of it and only land one or two kicks. It wasn't too long for this phase to be easily flawless, with only a couple of missteps here and there with the positioning of the Raging Fist counters, but of course it's only half of the fight, and you follow this up by facing off against Infernal Shadow. Each of the phases of the fight begin with a lunge attack, and these lunge attacks are by far the best attacks for getting in your damage, both in terms of countering them as they come in, and following them up with extra attacks and combo chains in between it. The boss tends to teleport in and out on occasion, and so it ended up being this bit of a more passive dance on my part to avoid the more dangerous 4-hit combo that the Shadow can do, and trying to bait the lunges by staying at a middling distance to encourage them to do it, whilst just getting in fireball counters in the meantime from the Fire and fireball projectiles that are thrown your way. This tactic mostly plays out the same in the second segment, though an extra fireball is thrown in with Fire that you have to be aware of, as well as some extra named skills. Incinerate and Eruption are very easy to dodge, giving you ample time to just walk off of them. However, Hammer and Anvil's timing is a bit more tricky, as there isn't much of a visual indicator between the shadow at making the attack and coming down and slamming into the ground, so most of the time it was safer to use Rook's Gambit's extra dodge frames even if you missed the perfect timing for the counter to safely avoid it. Dodging can work with it, as it is still a single hit and doesn't have lingering damage, but it does take a little bit of a getting used to the feel of the exact timing to pull it off. Hellfire sucking me in proved no issue, as Shiva's dodge was more than enough to keep out of it, but do keep in mind that the fire from the explosion lasts a fair few seconds, and I did lose one run to an ignition that went straight into the afterglow. Beyond this point, however, it's mostly applying the same principles. I don't recall any new skills getting added in Stage 3, though the named skills get used a little bit more. And so with just a little bit of patience, the battle will soon be won. You'll have achieved victory over your inner self, and embraced your fate. Did I say embrace your fate? Well, it's already time to deny it. First things first, a huge shout out to Masayoshi Soken for the soundtrack. Both phases of this boss's music are top tier, and definitely up there for some of my favourite tracks from this game. The good news is, once again, the ads at the start don't matter for the Medal of Valor. Typhon is also the first time we get to control Ifrit with the controls aligning more with Clive's as he normally does, which has a much better feel compared to the clunkiness you have in the fight against Garuda. This does in turn mean that Phase 1 of Typhon serves mostly like a tutorial for how to play Ifrit, so it's not too difficult to beat. All the attacks are single hits bar one, which is 2 strikes in short enough succession that dodging and counter-attacking the first still doesn't get you hit by the second. The only attack that I occasionally get caught off guard with is the lunge, as being too close to it means you have to dodge earlier than when you're further away, and mixing up those two timings sometimes led to me getting hit. Another fun tidbit of NG Plus is Ifrit has access to Brimstone and Spitflare already too, so you can use their abilities to stun and block attacks to your heart's content. I predominantly reserved Brimstone for this hand laser attack, as dodging too soon meant dodging into the lasers, so it's just a safer option, though it does explode afterwards. Don't let that catch you off guard. Typhon does also have an attack where he launches a lot of small projectiles. It's easier to perfect dodge chain through them compared to the Garuda fight, but outranging them is still usually the better method. Well, safer method. Phase 2 amps the entire fight up a notch. Almost every attack has some form of upgrade to it. Unending Clamour is the most notable, with 3 AoEs instead of 1, and whilst you can double dash with Wildfire to get behind an attacked Typhon, it's often safer to dodge to the side. Keep in mind the AoEs do linger for a second, so don't be too hasty about dashing through them. Most attacks now have chains of 2 to 3 hits with decent homing, though there's enough of a gap between each one to get some counters in between. The slashes of magic are also very good for fireball counters, though I have on more than one occasion instinctively done a melee counter on the first one and gone face first into the second one. The other main projectile attacks, the flurry of smaller balls that I previously mentioned, now home in after a short delay, which doesn't make them too much harder to dodge, but is something to be mindful of as they will shoot you in the back if you dodge past them as they're being launched. Demon Wall is also a fun little minigame that Wildfire dashing is designed specifically for. The layout is always the same, so there's no difficulty there, and the only way that it can really trip you up is if you get too close too fast, the walls will spawn and not give you as much time to move. And finally, there's this AoE spin that sends out shockwaves. There's enough time to get in a counter hit between each of the 3 swings, but once again I decided to play it safe. It's funny what 3 ad phases, a series of cinematics, and a first phase does to a person trying to flawless a boss in terms of the risks that they're willing to take. Even in this situation where one hit would have quite literally stagged him, but oh well, live and learn. And with that, we're through the first act. Whilst in terms of the total Medal of Valor bosses we're slightly less than halfway, it's thematically a good place to put a pin in this challenge, as far as the game's progression is concerned. Given, on top of that, we have a few extra bosses of my own addition in this part, and the total covered should hopefully be equivalent to what we have in the second half. At least in theory. And if there's one thing that I'm sure we all know about games, is that they definitely always get easier as you progress. I'm sure we've definitely reached the pinnacle of difficulty, and now that I'm warmed up fighting these bosses, the next half will be over in no time. Thank you for staying with me for this long with my ramblings, and I hope that I've either inspired you to try your hand at these bosses, or perhaps you already have and would like to share your own experiences, as well as how your strategies will have varied from my own. I hope to have the next part out relatively soon after this video goes up, but that does all depend on how quickly I can, as the kids say, get good. I was initially planning to finish them all up before uploading, but I began running out of file space, so wanted to get most of what I had uploaded before continuing, just in case I deleted footage and then it got corrupted and I wasn't able to recover it effectively. So instead, here we are with a slightly more staggered approach. Regardless, I hope you enjoyed the video, and that you'll join me for part 2 when it does eventually come around. Take care, and I'll see you all next time.